In the previous episodes, we've covered the eastern reaches of the known world with Mataram and the United Holy Kingdoms, and the Carletons and Fort Quito, and ventured through the south with the Mungi and the Dahe. But now we turn our attention to the west of the known world, and the war that would form the most influential nation of Inkunzi. But before we talk about that war, we should discuss the players involved, and the first are the Porians. The Porians were a race of humans who worshipped the sun and valued equality. This didn't make them any calmer than other races as seen by Karpor, the only Porian tribe to awaken. Their first action was to expand northward to the border of the Eldari, claiming all the lands that separated them. During this, a man from Fort Ass would wander in from the west, looking for new lands to make money. This quickly grew into a formalized trade agreement with Fort Ass. Similar events would precipitate an agreement with those of Yenised to the east, who followed the trade god of the wind. Seeing the multitude of tribes on their borders, and with many of them being awakened tribes, Karpor formed the Karpor defense force of 2,500. The next big action that Karpor took was sending an ultimatum to the nearby tribe of Sarhinta, claiming that because the border between them was so loose, criminals had been using it to escape vengeance, and demanded that the Sarhintans allow the defense force to enter and recapture them. The Sarhintans claimed that anyone crossing the border was executed and sent several heads back, but Karpor didn't believe them, and sent the defense force to the border. The Sarhintans, having seen through this thin excuse, were ready with their own army, and despite some fancy cavalry maneuvers by Karpor in an attempt to hide a flanking force, no one could gain a clear advantage, and so Karpor backed down. However, their efforts with the other Porian tribes in Afrasara and Sadharana went better, forming the Porian Defense Pact to defend each other in case of an attack, with the two tribes also being open to uniting if a large enough threat appeared. Karpor then set to work expanding west along the river and developing extensive roadways to connect all members of the Defense Pact. Sarhinta obviously refused to participate. And this paid off, as a few years later, Ellis, the leader of Karpor, called another meeting of the Defense Pact and used the extensive road network, which was bringing them together and generating large amounts of wealth through local commerce, as an example of what a united Poria could do. The other chiefs were swayed, and the Porian state was formed. The Porian state, building off this success, continued expanding down the river, reaching the newly established Fort Boobies. They also started to prepare for war with Sarhinta, viewing their actions as insulting, and increased the new Porian defense force to 10,000. It was during this expansive time that a messenger from the east would arrive. Fort Quito called for aid. Unfortunately, with war preparations in the way, Ellis believed the distance was too great, and so only gave his condolences. A consequence of these expansions meant that the prized roadways that had brought the Porians together had become cumbersome and outdated, and so extensive efforts were made to improve it. This in turn allowed the Porians to go further west and establish relations with the people of Palmerstad. However, good times were going to come to an end, as war loomed on the horizon. The next player we'll talk about is the Eldari. Led by Victus Grimm, these are a people who value loyalty above all else, first to family, then friends, then the Eldari as a whole. And this loyalty was on full display, for upon hearing rumors of great commander leading the draconic armies in the east, Victus headed to Lunari, the most in danger, to try and unify and deter any conflict. Well, while Lunari was wary of Draconics, they weren't ready to give up their independence, but accepted a defensive pact. Afterwards, he sent messengers to the other Eldari tribes in Moonland and Sadland. They met in a neutral location, and Victus requested that they join the defense pact to guard against the inhuman hordes surrounding them. Moonland in particular, sharing a long border with the Orcs to the north, readily accepted, and the Eldari tribes were united in their protective alliance. During this time, traders from Karpor would start to ply their trade northward, and an agreement was hammered out between them and the Eldari tribes. Nothing else of note would happen between then when the storms of war would hit. Finally, we get to one of the catalysts of the war, Orcani. The Orcs were a warlike race, and the Orcani led by Thessalon were no exception, and this was proven as the first actions after the awakening was Thessalon giving a speech. Greenkin, for many years we have been disunited with our brothers, our most ancient pottery not even able to tell stories of our unions. For quite a long time, this has been a thorn in the side of my father, and now, with me in charge, it will be a thorn in mine. So I say we deal with it today. If you are one of the many courageous warriors that exist in our tribe, step forward. We will march to our greenkin east of us, and those who are against such an act may stay, sitting in their huts as time progresses around them, until they are consumed by it. We will unite our people and fight back against that time so that we may survive. It is my responsibility as chief of Orkhan to defend my greenkin, but in order to do that, we must be united. We have gone too long without a war flag of our own, and granted our city prospered, so did many of our enemies. It is time for war, and would display a war banner. This fire, he shouts, and everyone stops clapping, is the symbol of Pharaohlos, the symbol our enemies should fear. We will continually burn until we are snuffed out, showing our enemies what they fear most. Everyone, gather up. We march at dawn, calling upon 20,000 orcs. However, upon reaching the settlement of Grakedra and sizing up the defenders, he decided that it would be better to try and talk, meeting with the chief and asking him to join. Makthenki, the chief of Grakedra, was initially unimpressed at the attempt, declaring that it would be the worst sin of an orc to surrender peacefully. Thessalon backtracked, stating he didn't want them to surrender outright, but joined him on a raid against the humans to the west, and rode back to Orkani. Thessalon's men were understandably disappointed at not seeing battle, but he consoled them with promises of greater conflict in the future. This was seemingly confirmed when Makthenki came and agreed to commit to a large invasion of the river tribes to the south. Thessalon then went east to the Draconics of Urukhan, talking with the leader Kanar, and eventually securing a defensive pact and trade agreements, and west to those of Kalis, who were willing to join in on the raid, having hoped to expand southwards. He then learned that Grakedra had secured support from the eastern orcs of Ganavas, so now all 4 orc tribes were ready and willing to invade the Eldari to the south. What could go wrong? Well, orcs can go wrong. Some hot-headed militarists in Orkani raided Kalis, stealing large amounts of copper ore, and several Moonland villages in an attempt to provoke conflict. This, of course, soured relations between Orkani and Kalis. Thessalon, upon hearing the raids, was glad and put the materials to use, not thinking too much on it, building large palisades. He also sent scouts on horseback to the Eldari tribes to try and learn of their defenses, and learned that they only really had the river for defense. While preparations were underway, Thessalon decided to complete his father Taurus's idea of a mass graveyard where their honored dead could be laid to rest. After seeing that done, he gathered his people for another heroic speech, talking of an orc empire. It was afterwards that he learned that Kalis had formed an anti-Orkani pact with Moonland as a response to the raids, with Ion of Kalis denouncing the Orkani as kinslayers, claiming that the Eldari were far more loyal, and despite his best efforts, he was unable to sway them back to his side. It was during some last-minute training before the conflict, Thessalon found an orc called Makedon humming. Finding the noise pleasing, he called for the elders of the tribe and presented it, but they didn't seem impressed. In either case, Thessalon called for preparations to be made to ensure the tribe didn't starve, and it seemed to go over well. There also rose an interest in the Alexandrian mountains to the north, with many adventurers heading there to try and be the first to cross the mountains, and become Hermaeus quick-footed incarnate. Because of this, Thessalon ordered the construction of outposts to the north. Deciding that enough time had passed, he declared war on Kalis to bring them into the fold. Kalis, upon hearing this, called upon Moonland, who in turn called upon the Eldari Defense Pact, which brought all 4 Eldari tribes into the war. Hearing that he now faced 5 nations, Thessalon gave another heroic speech talking about no sympathy for Kalis and victory and being watched by the Dark One. He then sent scouts down past Eldari after hearing rumors of more humans and finding the Porian state. The scout, Thanin, would meet with Ellis and talk of war in the north. Ellis, believing the Eldari are attacking the orcs, was intrigued and when offered friendship and lands in the coming conquest, joined, even though he had just declared war on Sarhinta. And now all the players were set. Orkani, Grakedra, Ganavas, and the Porian state against Eldari, Lunari, Moonlin, Sadlin, Kalis, and Sarhinta. The Porians, eager to finally settle things with the Sarhentans, moved quickly, sending the Porian defense force into Sarhenta. Sarhenta responded, and a fierce battle ensued. Initially, they were able to push the Porians back, but a second Porian army of 5,000 arrived and turned the tide, sending them scattering. Sarhenta quickly capitulated, and the Porians then moved north, engaging Eldari forces that had been gathering on the other side of the river. Meanwhile, militia forces were rising across the land as thousands answered the call to arms. As these forces coalesced, the Eldari attacked over the river, driving the Porians back. They then pivoted to the east, pincering a second Porian army and dispatching the Porian military. While the battles in the south were occurring, Berkeja had attempted to invade south into Moonland over the river. However, the forces of Moonland and Lunari had marshaled, and despite the orcs outnumbering them almost 2-1, they repelled multiple assaults. To the west, the orcs of Ganabest had marched, joining Thessalon and charging into Kalis. Moonland had moved to assist, but the combined orc armies overcame them and conquered Kalis. The war in the south, however, had decidedly turned in favor of the Eldari, who quickly moved to subjugate the rest of the Porian state. Putting down the remnants of the Porians, they then turned north and combined their forces to march against the orcs, charging north over the river. The orcs, exhausted by the constant assaults over the river, mustered what they could, but with 50,000 warriors arrayed against them, they couldn't manage to hold on and were sent packing, ending the war. The results of this conflict were profound. Kalis and Moonland joined together to form a new state of Kaaldari, which soon claimed the other orc lands. Eldari, Sadlin, and Lunari formed the Eldari Council, which claimed the Porian lands. Sarhenta soon joined, but opted to be a protectorate rather than directly controlled by the council. The newly formed council also moved and secured the Landless tribe, offering protection from dangers. Seeing the threat for what it was, Landless accepted. So, in rapid succession, the West region had gone from 13 tribes to just 2 allied superstates. It wouldn't be all good news, though. While Ellis Walsh, the leader of the Porian state, had been killed, his main general, Kyle Bolt, had fled to parts unknown and would become a thorn in the side of the new council for the days to come.